We tend to think of art in the terms of different crafts. We think about sculpture, we think about painting, and we think of these things as being separate from one another. There are a few arts that combine both elements, the element of sculpting combined with painting. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Bill Rice, who is an exponent of wildlife art, and his skill, his craft, is in this art of taking three-dimensional form and painting it. I'm Bill Merklein, and welcome. Bill, give me a little bit of your background. First of all, you're a very highly recognized artist in your craft. Tell me a little bit about your accomplishments.
Well, I was fortunate enough to be involved in the Leoki Woodson Birds and Art exhibit 5 years running. I was artist in residence at the Museum of Wildlife Art in Jackson Hole and featured sculptor 2 or 3 years ago. My work's shown in some very prominent galleries, J.N. Barfield's in New York, Settlers West in Tucson, and now Trailside in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I do shows once in a while. Typically I'll do a show for the Audubon Society or that type of thing, and that pretty much covers the gamut of commercial exposure.
Now the works we have today, we're going to take a little bit closer look at. Bill, tell us a little bit about what we're looking at.
This is a Blackburnian warbler, typically seen moving through this area about this time of year, late May, early June. They'll migrate up into Canada to breed, but they're one of my favorite of the warblers simply because of the color and the markings and the typical habitat that they use, a heavily dense woodland type habitat. As you can see, this one is included with a piece of laurel, which is very typical of their habitat, hemlock forest, that sort of thing. This is painted in oils, as are all my birds, as well as the laurel. The laurel is made of brass and copper, painted in artist oils, but very typical of any of the songbirds that I would do.
Bill, can you tell me a little bit about your thinking, about your process?
Typically, what I do is a bird will inspire me either by its coloration or by a position or a bird that I'm very familiar with. Sometimes I'll see a bird in a certain position and say, you know, not so much that bird, but a different bird in that position or with a different branch, that sort of thing. And once I have the bird and the position sort of formed in my mind, I'll just go to the drawing board and come up with some thumbnail sketches that pretty much dictate what my thought process is and follow that through, just expound on each drawing to drawing to drawing, refining what I really want to see out of the piece of work. And once I've got a thumbnail sketch that really hits the nail on the head, I'll make a pattern for it. Something that is typically pretty much a profile view, and work with that, come up with a pattern, and just take that pattern right to a block of wood and trace it on the wood, run that through the bandsaw, get the nice profile done. And once that's comes off the bandsaw, I'll use my hand tools primarily from there and go right down almost to the finished proportions with the hand tools. And what I try to do then is incorporate the branch with the bird, because there again the bird is pretty much going to have to work in concert with the branch. So some of the material will have to come off to get the proper leg positioning, and then I can get it on the branch and pretty much look at it from a 360-degree angle and from distance. Stepping back is very beneficial because as you're holding something in your hand, you can't get all the perspective that you really need in a three-dimensional piece. You need to step back, keep turning it and looking at it from different angles, not just from the sides, but from the top and even from the bottom to make sure proportions are correct. Once the proportions are correct, I'll go in and delineate the all the major feather patterns, typically the wing, tail, usually these side feathers underneath, and make up a pair of legs, which are typically made out of copper and brass, and form those to the branch, get those formed where they need to be. And once the legs are in, I can pretty much start doing individual feathers. You can see individual feathers and these secondary feathers here, and the primary feathers and the tails. Once the individual feathers are in and sculpted properly, I'll go for a very fine finishing, which is almost a finish surface, but that doesn't account for the texturing. I'll do some burn-in texturing and some modeling of the feathers, some undulations in some of the secondary feathers and the tail feathers. The bigger feathers will get some ripples and things like that, splits in the feathers. And from there, it's pretty much ready to paint.
Coming back to the very beginning of a project, the birds have individual characteristics. Do you try to pick up on something that you consider distinctive to that breed of bird when you sculpt?
That's an important aspect of this type of work, is that you bring out the characteristics in the positioning, and in this case with this eagle you can see a lot of the characteristics of the bird in the eye placement and the position of the head. Typically this is a good positioning for a bird of prey. It's in the ready position. If you were a rabbit, you wouldn't want to see this guy staring down at you from the branch of a tree in this position, because he's...
Well, I'm not a rabbit. I'm a little bit nervous.
He's in a position where he's in strike mode, and at any moment he'll launch himself off that branch and be after some sort of prey. Typically with a game bird, which is a much more docile type bird, you would have them in a much more, say, a warm and fuzzy position where they're more at ease, which they aren't in very often, but typically that shows off the bird better in a relaxed position as opposed to being always on guard. Songbirds are typically the same way. You want to show them in much more of a relaxed, docile, pretty much at ease position, where it's a much more pleasing presentation, I think, as opposed to you wouldn't want to see them in an aggressive position, which is what this eagle is in. You can see a little bit of the wings this way, if I turn a little bit, the shoulders. They're very, very strong wings. They can soar. An eagle is actually a very fast flyer, as big as they are. With those wings, they can fly at incredible speed. They're very good flyers. Massive feet. They've got all the right tools to be a bird of prey. They are like the ultimate predator on the wing. One of my very, very favorite birds.
Tell us a bit about this subject, Bill.
This is a cedar waxwing with a hawthorn branch as it's part of its composition. The reason I chose this is that these cedar waxwings are pretty much coast to coast. They have very, very wide distribution. Part of that reason being that it'll be going out to the show in Jackson Hole at the Miniatures and More show in September, and I need a piece with a fairly large recognition factor. And I really love these birds. I see them all the time. They love to be near the rivers in the summertime, and they catch a lot of bugs. In the wintertime, you'll see them in the yard a lot. They come for the crab apples and the hawthorns and things of that nature. So they're a bird I'm familiar with, and a bird I love to do. They've got great subtle colorations going on in them, including the little red striations off the back of the tertials here that you would never see on any other type of bird. That the Bohemian and cedar waxwings are the only ones that have that. But I love the color. I love the colors and the combination with the hawthorn branch. So it works as a piece and as a whole very, very nicely.
Now this piece is going out to a museum in the West?
Yes, it is. It's the National Museum of Wildlife Art in Jackson Hole. Every year they do a fundraising show. And they invite artists from all across the country to put a piece in the miniatures show uh, a big portion of which benefits the museum, and a portion, of course, a lot of it goes back to the artist as well. But it's a great time. It's a good function. It's a worthwhile museum to see. I highly recommend it. It's got work that would just completely blow your mind to see. Work from the old masters right up to contemporary artists as well.
Do you know approximately when the museum was established?
I don't know exactly, but it was the early 80s that it started up. It started up very, very small in downtown Jackson Hole. And they've since moved out of town to a much larger venue that is spectacular. I mean, it's just tremendous. The revolving exhibits that they have, and the Artists in Residence program is very, very encouraging for artists as well as for patrons.
And this is?
This is a white-crowned sparrow in progress, which will be actually going to reside in Colorado. But for the time being, I can use it to explain some of the process that you wouldn't be able to see if this were painted. You can see some of the copper leaves in place, the brass branch, some of the bare wood with some of the feather delineation in place, the eyes in place, pretty much almost to the point where it will be textured, after which it can be painted.
Bill, this is going to Colorado. This is a commission?
Yes, it is. This lady was kind enough to commission this piece, as well as two others actually. And actually I can show you a little bit more of what I was talking about earlier from this piece as well. What I was saying about incorporating the bird with the branch while in progress, you can see where the side feathers meet the branch. They have to look as if the bird had just landed on this branch, and some of the feathers will actually overlap the branch a little bit and work the feathers into the leg. As the leg is pulled out, it'll draw down some of the feathers with the leg. This angle actually better illustrates what I was talking about, the feathers overlapping the branch a little bit. You got to remember what you're working with here. It's feathers. They're so soft, you have to give that impression all the time and account for that in the painting as well as the carving. You can see some of these feather tracks in here as well that you might not even notice that they're delineated once it's painted, but without delineating them now before it's painted, you lose a lot of the effect of the softness and the feel you get from a group of feathers. One of the aspects that I can point out from this position and a bird in this stage is the delineation of the feathers actually is of crucial importance to when you start painting. A lot of times when you're carving like this, you're actually painting at the same time you're carving, so to speak, because what you're doing is creating shadows that you will pick up on with the paint later on down the road. These delineations in here, as well as up through the head, will all come into play as you start painting, and there really is no other way to get those effects than to combine the sculpture with the painting.
Bill, as if birds were not enough, you obviously just needed a little bit more detail in your work. Can you talk about this form of your art?
Yes, these feathers are actually an offshoot of the carvings. I love to paint, and that's one of the reasons why I do the carvings that I do, the birds that I do, is I'm just really interested in the colorations and painting in general. I started actually as a painter. I painted way before I ever did any carving. And this is just one more avenue to express myself through the medium of oil paint. All of these feathers have a little bit of a different technique involved in them. The blue jay feather is probably the most straightforward. It's a lot.
That's the one on the left.
Correct. The blue jay feather has a lot of shading with just a little bit of markings going on in it. So it will show a little bit of markings that go on, but the biggest thing with these is to keep the markings soft. If you run a dark color sharply against a light color, it destroys the softness of the feather. You'll see it down in here and along the bars on this blue jay feather. It has to be still a bit of a soft edge there, otherwise it destroys the effect. The wood duck feather in the center here is an iridescent feather. So you're looking for a little bit of a different technique with the paint. It's a lot of shading on this left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, that's not as much shading as it is an impressionist technique where you lay light against dark, warm against cool. There's actually a lot of warmer coloration down in here that'll brighten up these blue aspects and actually make that blue explode like it's an iridescent color. The quail feather is much different than the other two. This feather, what I'll do is paint the lighter shades of the reddish tones in a very neutral paint, just a raw umber and white. So it's got a gray background where the markings are. And after that's dry, I'll go in and pick up the color on top of that raw umber undercoat, and it really makes those warm earth tones pop out. Once those are established, I'll just use what's left as raw wood coming through to lay the darker markings over that raw wood. So the darker markings haven't got anything light underneath them. So when the darker paint is applied over the wood, it just gives you a really nice underlay for a darker paint. If the lighter color were underneath the dark, it would sap a lot of the darkness out of those darker colors. So without any paint underneath them, they can stand on their own, and they stand out much better as opposed to the lighter markings.
Well, Bill, as we come to the wrap-up of our little talk today, one of the things I'd love to point out to people, a couple of things I'd like to point out, is that we've been looking at unique work. We're not looking at castings that have been painted in China, and these are genuine works of art, which is a very interesting point, because this has been an art form that has evolved out of a necessary craft of hunters, of carving decoys.
Right.
Can you just give us a little bit of that transition of history from that point to this point?
Well, I find it interesting that you can see pretty much firsthand the evolution of an art form here, from what was a utilitarian tool to actually what was considered a folk art to now what is more or less fine art, which is probably brought out by the use of the habitat, the compositional elements, the use of color, how it relates to the habitat that's being used, and the capturing of the expression of a bird, the likeness of the bird, the characteristics. See, these birds, you can feel the movement, you can feel tension, you can feel in some of the pieces a contented attitude. Those are all emotions that go along with what is part of being a piece of art, a work of art. And I think these birds epitomize a lot of those aspects of truly what is a beautiful art form that's come of age in a very short period of time, that's actually still ongoing and developing as we speak.
We talked about it a little bit off camera, but we are at a time in history where people in this generation are seeing the birth of a new art form evolved from a folk tradition.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, as things have gone on, I mean, things develop at a very, very rapid pace now. But it's sort of intriguing that even in this time and age where everything's electronic and everything's digital, to see a basic art form branch out at this point in time is somewhat miraculous. I mean, it's still appreciated. I mean, and that's wonderful to see. People are still connected with the environment, the natural world around them, and this is an example of that.
Well, one of the things I'd like to point out also is that when that happens, when a new art form is born, it is a very interesting thing that two things come together. One is that it is born because there's a need within the artist to express this. And without a particular history, one has to find their own way, their own path from point A to point B, which you have done magnificently. The works here do not show up on a screen as well as they do in real life. Nothing ever does. It is astonishing to see the work in person. I feel very privileged. And as you and I have talked off camera, you understand where I come from in my particular art to admire what you do. Very meaningful. I would also like to take a moment to thank the Gregory James Gallery here in New Milford, Connecticut, and to Greg Mullins, who is the sponsor of these films, and a terribly considerate and concerned gentleman, and also a man who is probably wanted in multiple states because he refuses to be seen on camera. So with my apologies, because I would have loved to have shown you our benefactor in this series, I just want to say thank you also to Bill, to Mr. Rice, for going out of his way to work with us again today. And Bill, it's been a real privilege.
Oh,
I thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Until next time, this is Bill Merklein, and we thank you all very much.